Hey, wait a minute. Didn't we already talk about this card? Yes, we did. That's not why I'm here today. In fact, this is why I'm here today. Welcome back to another episode of RetroTechBytes. What you see before you is the Creative 3D Blaster PCI. It's the brother, sister, cousin, nephew, friend, I don't know. It's a distant relative to the Creative 3D Blaster VLB that's somewhat famous, or rather infamous, for its lack of performance, yet VLB 3D acceleration. This card came out in 1996, and yeah, it uses a Rendition Vérité V1000E chip. It's not even the same chip that's on the other 3D Blaster, so what's the deal with it? Interestingly, or perhaps weirdly enough, despite its limitations, the Verite V1000E is a rather fascinating piece of kit. This particular card is compatible with Creative Graphics Library, Redline, Speedy 3D, as well as DirectX, and there's kind of an OpenGL implementation that sort of works. But yeah, as compatible as the card is, it's got a few quirks. Notably though, one of the most important and impactful things about it is that it sort of served as a model device for Microsoft's DirectX implementation. So despite its rather unastounding performance, it definitely does deserve some credit as being the killer DirectX card or Direct3D card that sort of pushed the standard. This card was, well, predated the Voodoo 1, but it did things differently than the Voodoo 1. This chip here, the V1000, is actually a RISC programmable processor of a sort, and yeah, I mean, Rendition were the first to take this approach of using a RISC core and then just programming it for graphics acceleration. There's some obvious issues like lack of a Z buffer and whatnot, but for the most part, it's a pretty advanced design, and it provides some really nice images, and it looks great in games. But the Verite is slow. I mean, objectively speaking, the V1000 is slow. But as far as compared to its newer and, much more complicated sibling, it's not as slow as you'd think. It's actually quite competent and capable of running many of the same games. But why is this creative card so fascinatingly weird? Our story begins in 2004, of all places, in a May 2004 issue of Maximum PC. Dubbed the first true 3D accelerator in a sea of 3D decelerators, the Rendition Vérité V1000 certainly sent shockwaves through the market when it was released in 1996. A novel idea, the card conveyed to average people that now was their time. They could play 3D accelerated games like V-Quake and, well, the whole host of the CGL library, at least for the 3D Blaster PCI. The 3D Blaster PCI was aggressively marketed as the product that you were missing. Creative Labs detailed the card's incredible compatibility. API support ranged from the relatively new Direct3D and DirectDraw to the Creative Graphics Library, a proprietary creative API, and even Speedy 3D and later Redline, the latter two of which were Rendition products meant for the Verite line of cards. The 3D Blaster PCI was the successor, or rather sibling as aforementioned, to the 3D Blaster VLB. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about that card, but the gist of it is, it was a VLB-based 3D accelerator that used the 3D Labs Game Glint, and it provided 3D acceleration for 486s and other VLB-compatible motherboards. It's not exactly regarded as one of the best 3D accelerators. In fact, it's kind of regarded as crap. Like literally, the review just says it's crap. And the 3D Blaster PCI had big shoes to fill, and indeed, it used the right equipment. The killer app was the Rendition Vérité V1000E. Fabian Sanglart's website details a lot of technical information about the Verite, but there's a few things I think that are worth highlighting. The first of which is, the card itself had a 25 megapixel per second fill rate, which was incredible at the time. Another key factor leading into the development of the Verite was the dramatic drop in the price of RAM. 50 nanosecond EDO RAM was used on the card, and the price had dropped substantially before production began. In fact, this 50 nanosecond EDO RAM enabled latency drops of up to 30%, relative to older DRAM cards, that is. The card wasn't all sunshine and rainbows though, there were definitely issues, and one of which was the RISC-based design didn't really allow for a hardware accelerated Z buffer. There are various other videos out there that will probably give you a better understanding of what a Z buffer actually is, but the important thing is, as soon as things on a Z-axis were rendered, issues arose. And yeah, considering 3D is literally X, Y, and Z, that's kind of a problem. Despite the fact that the frame rate was literally halved because the fill rate dropped by half, the Verite made a powerful entry into the market. And yeah, there were a few others that were released. The Sierra Screamin' 3D, yes, that Sierra, the game company Sierra, and the Intergraph Intense 3D both used the Verite V1000. Those two cards, the 3D Blaster PCI by Creative, which we're focusing on here, and the Canopus Pure 3D were all excellently received. For the most part, they offered basic but functional 2D acceleration and excellent 3D acceleration, which, for the cost, was comparable to none on the market. The Voodoo 1 was just a twinkle in 3DFX's eyes, and well, for the most part, there were no other decent 3D cards out there. Compared to the ATI Rage 3D and the S3 Verge, the Verite V1000 was a complete new idea and a new entry into the market. It definitely lacked a lot of features that later cards would come to have as standard, such as full OpenGL support and a functional Z buffer, but for the most part, the card itself was just brilliant. It was lauded and heavily anticipated, and the 3D Blaster PCI was right there lumped in with the rest of them. Compared to everything else out there, there was nothing like it. 2D performance wasn't great, a Windows accelerator this really ain't. And arguably, and somewhat ironically, that's perhaps where the 3D Blaster VLB would fare better with its 3D Labs Glint-derived chip. But without a doubt, everything else was left eating dirt, literally in the words of PC Mag. The Cirrus Logic Laguna, the 3D Rage 2, and the Verge couldn't compete. And with the pace at which these accelerators were accelerating, the technology was developing so fast as to really push things into the next level, and this came really quickly. The Verite was a brave first step into a relatively unknown and new market, but as a matter of fact, it was the first step. The others that came after it were just so much more powerful and capable, so looking back on the Verite is kind of odd because it represents the first usable 3D accelerator, not the first good 3D accelerator if you're looking at it from, well, not through a pair of rose-tinted glasses. And look, I'm not here to deride the Verite. It's an impressive card and a fantastic achievement as far as a step forward in the marketplace, but realistically looking back, it's not that special. Sure, the nifty API support for the 3D Blaster PCI makes it a really interesting card, and its tie-in to the concurrent 3D Blaster VLB is impressively interesting, but as a matter of fact, there is little to no regard for the Verite V1000 when the V2200 is just a superior product. Or is there? Looking back, even when the Rendition Vérité was no longer the fastest board on the block in mid-1997, it was still regarded as one of the best cards you could buy just for the sheer value. The Canopus Pure 3D and the Intergraph Reactor 3D both provided tie-ins and bundles that were just so much better than anything else on the market. And for the speed of the card you got, it was a fantastic buy. Bear in mind too that this card was only $149 thereabouts by this point in time. Compared to a Voodoo, this was a substantial sum less and substantially more performant than an S3 Verge. God, I really shouldn't name this video the S3 Verge sucks, but I'm kind of going on that tangent, aren't I? To be fair, the Verge is great in 2D. But value proposition aside, it's also important to point out that the 3D Blaster PCI is the only Verite card that can easily run 3D Blaster games. Most of the famous games, if you want to label them that, but they're not really that well known, for creative graphics libraries such as Rebel Moon, Battle Arena Toshinden, and even games like Actua Soccer and Screamer 2 and Screamer Rally, all supported the CGL library, but when you launch the game, it looks for the 3D Blaster, and some of the games actually have a biosignature that they're looking for. Ghana has an absolutely brilliant website about how to get these games to run on cards that aren't the 3D Blaster PCI. Do note that even the 3D Blaster PCI isn't perfect. CGL is a weird API, and as a matter of fact, there were so few games that supported it and so few demos and such little documentation that While it runs on other cards like the Primidia NT and the Cirrus Logic Laguna, the performance is not great, and there are definitely bugs. Hell, even the 3D Blaster PCI can't run certain implementations. Game support varies wildly, even between the VLB and PCI variants of the card, and that I think is due at least in part to the fact that one is using a 3D Labs game glint, and the other one is using a Rendition Vérité, both of which are not even close to the same architecture, nor are they even close to the same implementation. Forgetting the bus differences and target audience differences, the fact is CGL is implemented differently on these cards, and so different things can run. The version of Rebel Moon, which is one of the well-known tie-in games that came with these cards, is actually different between the VLB and PCI card. And a huge thanks to Vogon's user Vets, who has an absolutely brilliant page detailing the games that can run on CGL. He actually also has some more information regarding the 3D Blaster on a different thread on Vogon's, but this is the one that, if you're looking for games, is probably going to interest you the most. Notably, there are a handful of titles, and some of them have to be patched to work on the PCI variant, and some have to be patched to work on the VLB variant. Cross-compatibility is an issue, as mentioned, and this makes picking what games you want to play in CGL kind of tough. Truthfully, the game that caught my attention and I was the biggest sucker for was Rebel Moon. Rebel Moon is, well, it's one of these games that just piques my interest because it's a sci-fi first-person shooter set on the moon. I mean, how cool is that? But what's actually fascinating is the version bundled with the 3D Blaster PCI is not equivalent to the version bundled with the 3D Blaster VLB. The VLB version is older and a little bit quirkier, and it doesn't seem to run as well. But one big spoiler and one big thing you should know is, as much as it says on every website you'll ever read that you need a 3D Blaster PCI or 3D Blaster VLB to play this game, or some of the other CGL games, that's objectively not true, at least with regard to Rebel Moon specifically. Why? Well, you can launch the game in a way that actually just renders it in software. If you just type -VGA, the game will run. And here it is running on my main PC in DOSBox X. It runs just fine, and this is being rendered in software. You don't get all the nice advantages, and, everything doesn't look as good, obviously, as it would if you were using a 3D Blaster as properly intended, but this is the version of the game meant for the 3D Blaster VLB, and here it is running just fine. In fact, before even getting the 3D Blaster PCI, I used to play the VLB version in software on my 486, but performance was not great. Even in DOSBox X, you can tell that it's okay. It's a smooth experience, but there's some screen tearing, and it doesn't look as nice as it otherwise should. But on the 3D Blaster, it's a totally different story, and I will be showing that shortly. But as a matter of fact, you can play Rebel Moon, and you don't really need a 3D Blaster, so that was kind of a myth that I felt need to be busted, so myth busted? But hey, while we're looking at some gameplay, let's look at some other gameplay and test out the 3D Blaster PCI. As far as actually installing the card goes, it's a pretty simple affair. You just insert the CD and go. The one notable addition to the software, however, is the soft MPEG decoder, which allows you to decode MPEG-1 video. The card had the ability to do so in hardware, but this is just some software that provides additional playback for MPEG format files. Compared to the ostensibly rough time that I had getting the V2200 going, the V1000 was a cinch. After installing the drivers, everything worked as expected, and frankly, the creative drivers were fantastic. A few programs were installed as far as controls, and a few hotkeys were installed, but beyond that, it wasn't really that bloated, and everything just worked. It was honestly kind of surprising, but very pleasant. First up, we gotta talk about Rebel Moon. This was the killer app for this card. The version bundled with the 3D Blaster PCI became one of its main selling points, and frankly, it's an awesome version of the game. It's strikingly different from the VLB version and features CD music as well as new environments, enemies, and weapons. The first-person perspective is actually changed a little bit too from the VLB version, and the difficulty seems to be increased somewhat, but the game plays flawlessly. So let's check it out. Here's some gameplay. And yeah, I mean, what may seem simple and basically like a Doom clone at first turns into a really enriching and engaging experience. The game runs really well on the card and looks gorgeous. The environments are deep and scenic, and the music is atmospheric.
In many ways, it's an underrated gem, and that's probably because it was never really mass marketed. Sure, there was a sequel, Rebel Moon Rising, that was bundled as a full box game, but beyond that, Rebel Moon itself has a legacy as being the 3D Blaster add-in. It was nothing more, and it continues to be nothing more. But that's really a shame, because this game offers a lot, and it's an absolute blast. Next, let's take a look at V-Quake. V-Quake, or Verite Quake, was a specific version of Quake meant to run on the Rendition Vérité. It was the first 3D accelerated version of the game and actually had some extra commands. Bundled with the 3D Blaster PCI is an older version of V-Quake, the actual first edition of it, so to speak. And if you notice, when I change the anti-aliasing settings, you can actually tell there's a difference in the world. It's probably not great due to the capture setup, but if you look at the lava, you can actually see some differences on the far right of the screen. So, what did V-Quake add to the experience? Well, as the first 3D accelerated version of Quake, it really was kind of basic. I mean, there were some enhanced water effects, the lighting was a little different, the rendering just looked better overall, and anti-aliasing was nice, but the gameplay itself is pretty much the same. For the most part, it's your standard old Quake, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. Unlike the later and arguably more enhanced GL Quake, V-Quake seems more true to the software Quake formula. Chunky pixels, dark lighting, atmospheric setting. It's a perfect version of the game if you want some 3D acceleration while retaining the base game's looks. It plays just as good as it looks too. It's a smooth experience and really couldn't be better. The 3D Blaster PCI is excellent if you want to really experience V-Quake at its finest. And considering that the bundled add-in floppy was meant only for Quake, yeah, this was going to be an excellent experience because the card is just that cool. Jumping a year ahead to when the card was basically out of date, we can take a look at Quake 2. Here's the Quake 2 time demo side by side. On the right is V-Quake, well, V-Quake 2, with all of the enhancements turned on. And on the left is software rendered Quake 2. The software renderer is pretty well optimized, and on our Pentium II 333, this game runs pretty well. We're averaging about 15 FPS at 640 by 480. On the 3D Blaster, I was hoping for better results. I changed the R surface lookup command to render the triangle setup on the CPU instead of the Verite, and there was no change. The performance remained adequate, but we lose about 1 or 2 FPS on the Verite. That being said, the game actually looks a little bit better, and, anti-aliasing is pretty nice, I will say that. But if you're looking for a good Quake 2 experience, honestly, the V2100 is the way to go. The V1000 is just a little bit too old and too slow to handle a game like this. But let's flip back a second and take a look at other CGL games. Here's Flight Unlimited, which provides you with a really interesting interactive 3D menu. Flight Unlimited is one of those games that I had high hopes for, but yeah. The environment looks great, the rendering is nice, and the game plays pretty well, surprisingly, for a DOS game being run in Windows 95, but that's about as good as you're going to get. There were issues with sound compatibility even in DOS mode, and the other thing I found to be really troublesome with this game was the controls. They're just so antiquated that it is hard to play this game. But, I had to go for one of those interesting results and tried crashing the plane just to see what would happen, and the results were spectacular. This game is a real gem. I can't say I recommend it, but it's a load of fun. Actua Soccer is one of the other native CGL games, and it plays pretty well. Considering I'm not great at soccer games unless they're FIFA on a PlayStation, I really wouldn't consider this to be the most playable of soccer games, but the 3D rendering is nice and it runs well. Except there's kind of an issue. And yeah, stay tuned to the end and you'll see exactly what I mean.
Finland and Bulgaria. Victory in this game will go a long way to success in the tournament. Litmanen. Heikkinen. Litmanen.
Okay, so we're going for it, we're going for it, we're going for it, we're going for it, and we're getting ready to score, setting it up, seeing how it's going to go. Yep, kind of weaving in and out. This is really lame gameplay and commentary, but yeah, that wasn't me. That's the game. Unfortunately, not much can be done unless IRQ sharing is turned off and the card has a dedicated IRQ, but it's really not worth messing with IRQs in hardware configuration in Windows 95, at least not for this game alone. And last but not least, we have 3D accelerated Tomb Raider. This is just the demo, but as you can tell, the game runs and looks pretty great. I personally prefer the lighting and looks of the later ATI CIF port, but the truth is, compared to even the 3DFX port, I would say this is more than adequate. The game runs pretty brilliantly, and it looks fantastic. The anti-aliasing is nice, the edges are sharp and crisp, the textures look great, the lighting is nice. For the most part, it looks like Tomb Raider should, and that's what the Verite is good at. Is it the best card? Not really. But it provides a more than adequate experience, and for the time, it was groundbreaking. It's an absolutely stunning piece of technology when you consider it was released in 1996 and predates even the Voodoo 1, and frankly, that's where its strengths lie. It's an old card, but that doesn't make it a bad card, and it's certainly an interesting one to take a look at. Considering the 3D Blaster PCI is a version of the Verite that just happens to be the sibling to the legendary 3D Blaster VLB, that makes the card even cooler. And considering the CGL games that were available, like Rebel Moon and Battle Arena Toshinden and Actua Soccer, you can't really go wrong with the card. Unfortunately, these are not exactly easy to find, but considering most Verite should be pretty much compatible, it would be worth checking out. And at the very least, I do recommend checking out Rebel Moon through software rendering because it's a blast. It's really a great game. But overall, the Verite, it's an interesting card. It's not the best card, it's not the worst card, but it fits in that place in history that's just too astounding not to stop and take a look at. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. If you did enjoy this video, make sure to check out some of my other videos about other 3D cards, like the Intel 740, or the ATI Rage 3D, or even the 3DFX Voodoo Rush and the Verite V2200, all of which are available on my channel. There'll be plenty more content like this coming in the future, but we're going to take a look at some things that aren't graphics cards. For now though, this is just another interesting look into another part of history, and this has been another episode of RetroTechBytes.